profession. I'm a broadcaster. I make radio programs. I write books, and probably right now I'm the most overdressed man in Miami. So I want to tell you why I became so obsessed with food diversity, and it is a form of biodiversity. Some call it agrobiodiversity. And when I started to write my book back in 2018, I had an editor working with me, and she said, well, what do you mean by an endangered food? It seemed a very unfamiliar subject area. And I told the story of one food that actually is relevant to the UK, but I think this is a universal story wherever we are in the world. I explained that around 100 years ago, it was possible in England to eat an apple a day for 4 years without eating the same apple twice. There was that much diversity in terms of what was produced in the orchards of England. And as you will be familiar, that diversity disappeared in the 20th century to be replaced with uniformity and consistency, and probably if I went into a British supermarket and saw the apple selection, it would be very similar to the type of apples that you would see on sale in the US as well. So that's the process that I became really interested in. And then the question is, well, why should we care? And I'll explore that in this talk. But what also was possible 100 years ago in England is that people would have not only the knowledge, but also the palate by which they would understand which apple was arriving when in the season, how it might be stored, what its different uses might be, its different flavors, and people would talk about this over the table as well. So we've lost genetic diversity, we've lost knowledge, we've lost something about our ability to sense that diversity as well. A bit about my background. I grew up in England in the 1970s and 80s, but I spent time in Sicily, where my father came from. And so I was unusual in that I had this ability to step from one food culture in England, where food was becoming increasingly processed and the supermarkets were growing in power. And at the same time, I would go to my dad's village, Ribera, in the southwest of Sicily, and I would stay with my nonna, and we would get to walk into citrus groves and onto farms. My Italian wasn't very good, so I would be sitting around the table and people would be shouting at each other. I thought some family feud was underway. They were just disagreeing about where to find the best cannoli. But that was a formative experience, because not only did it show me how food was produced and how much diversity there was out there, but also this idea that people told stories about food. And that's now my profession in radio and in books and articles. And around 15 years ago, I came across, I think, what was the best treasure trove of stories that it was possible for a food journalist to find. And this was Slow Food's Ark of Taste, which many of you might be familiar with. And this was started by the slow food movement in Italy. And slow food in the north of Italy in the 1980s was launched by a small group of people concerned about the arrival of fast food in Italy. So they set up slow food to try and celebrate and inform and share the pleasures of more traditional foods. What they also noticed was things were disappearing. So a type of pepper was no longer available, which meant that there was a certain dish was no longer possible to make, or the flavor had to change. And so they created this catalog called the Ark of Taste, Noah's Ark of Taste, which was to be a way in which you could identify not only what were the world's most endangered foods, but also the information that they exist and that there was something that people could do to try and save these foods. So from the 1990s to today, that catalog has grown to more than 6,000 endangered foods around the world. and covers 150 different countries, and it's every conceivable type of food, whole food that you can imagine. So we're talking about legumes, we're talking about all types of fruits, breeds of animals as well. So I came across this catalog, and I made radio programs for many, many years, telling stories of this diversity, this world of endangered foods, because each one of these foods took me to a part of the world, sometimes physically, that I would travel and be lucky enough to find these foods, but also just as a journalist, the idea that these foods from around the world came from a place, were linked to a type of community, they have a history. And again, as I mentioned, I became obsessed with this idea of food diversity, endangered foods, and the opportunity to tell stories through these endangered foods as well. So just an example of some of these 6,500 endangered foods. One comes from the wild forests of northeastern India, where the ancestor of all of the oranges grown around the world still exists, and people live with that edible biodiversity. They use the fruit for cooking as an ingredient. It's also a source of medicine, and it's extremely sour and bitter, which many of our of the wild foods, the ancestors of most of our foods, certainly fruits, are. And so it contains anthocyanins and other types of chemicals that are beneficial, not only to us, but with the plant's defense mechanism as well. So we bred that out. We created sweeter fruits, which meant we had to spray the crop, the global crop, with more and more chemicals. So just one tiny little snapshot from one wild fruit. I went to the Bolivian Andes and saw how much diversity of tubers people were growing, and this mind-blowing idea that thousands of years ago, in order for humans to migrate and travel into some of the most extreme environments on Earth and live there and survive, this interaction between humans and wild plants that over time become the oca and the potatoes, other tubers that we have today. And then this story here, the sea island red pea, or the geechee pea, was shown to me by somebody at a slow food event in Italy a few years ago. It was a farmer from Georgia, a black farmer who'd recognized this pea when somebody showed it to him at a slow food event. He recognized this because this was part of his family story. And in this tiny pea, it tells the story of the movement of enslaved people from West Africa to the American South 300 years ago. So this idea of this movement of people, but also foods. And so it was possible to tell so many different stories from this catalogue of endangered foods. Stories also matter because we are so overwhelmed with the complexity of what is called the food system. So the idea of how we produce food, how it's farmed, the resources it takes, the distribution networks, the economics, trade, politics involved in all of that. And I think that often means that people are disconnected with some of the important ideas and decisions they can make. So I think storytelling is really important, and as a species, as humans, we thrive, we crave stories. So this idea that there was huge amounts of diversity that is disappearing and lost became the subject matter for my book, which was published in 2022 in the US. But actually, most of what I say, or at least the big ideas and arguments that I present in the book, are not new. So if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, the scientist who coined the term genetics, William Bateson, who was at Cambridge, came out of a world of wheat breeding and farming and agriculture. So the idea of the understanding of genetics is very much intertwined with people who are hoping to understand where our food came from and the evolution of different crops around the world. And the person who really became interested in that idea was a Russian botanist, Nikolai Vavilov, who studied under Bateson, the person who coined the term genetics, But Nikolai Vavilov, already in the 1920s and 30s, was becoming concerned about how much diversity was being lost in the fields of farmers around the world. And so he went off on a mission on behalf of the Soviet Union, but also he believed humanity, to travel to as many different places as he could to find the seeds of as many different edible plants, the crops, as possible, bring them back to collect them in a seed bank, which he did in St. Petersburg in Russia. And he traveled across 5 continents, concerned that we were losing the very genetic material that we would need in the future to feed the world. And it was his work, by studying where food diversity exists, that he started to map out where our food came from. So the idea of where did wheat begin? Where did its story begin? Where was the story of maize? And you could also say tomatoes as well. All of these were things that he was looking at. Where are the origins of this diversity? Because if you can find out where the origins are, you also find the greatest diversity, because that's how the plant that's had the longest amount of time. And there are these gene pools that exist where you can find the greatest diversity of a crop. So, for example, here we have a map of one of the most contested parts of the world now, a place we associate with conflict in the Middle East. But this is the Fertile Crescent, where 10, 12,000 years ago, our ancestors, the earliest farmers, were interacting with wild grasses and starting to select, consciously and unconsciously, the ones that would give them the most seed, edible seed, the grain. And over a period of thousands of years, that interaction between humans and wild grasses gave us the most important sources of energy that we have on the planet today. Rice, around the same time, so we're talking about 7,000, 8,000 years ago, in the river valley basins of China, humans interacting with wild grasses, making selections. And this gives us rice domestication. The most mind-blowing story of all, I think, is one of teosinte in southern Mexico, and again, around the same time. The thing is, with rice and wheat, you would recognize the wild ancestors of those crops. Maize, no. I mean, teosinte is this very tough, small, not particularly generous plant, and if you bit into it, most likely you'd break your teeth. But again, over thousands and thousands of years, farmers interacting with these wild grasses create these lush, rich, energy-giving, delicious cobs of corn. The first farmers who were interacting with teosinte had no idea where the plant would end up in thousands of years' time, feeding communities of their descendants. But this long unfolding process, and we are the beneficiaries of that, because not only in our lifetimes, but in the lifetimes of humans going back maybe 3,000 or 4,000 years, there have been no major domestication events. We have inherited this legacy of thousands of years of farming around the world. Vavilov collected all of this diversity and documented the centers of origin in order to create food for the future. Unfortunately, he fell out of favor with Stalin and died of the very thing that he was trying to prevent. So he starved to death in a Russian prison because he was seen as a threat to the Soviet Union's Marxist idea of science and also politics. There were other people, as with Vavilov. For example, someone called Arthur Ernest Watkins, who'd fought in the First World War in France. And his responsibility was to try and find food sources, which meant that he went to lots of different farms in France and noticed there were differences in the different types of wheat that different farmers were growing. And so when he came back to England, he was teaching in Cambridge, and he sent out letters to members or people working for the British Empire all over the world to say, can you please send me seeds, wheat seeds, so I can collect them save them and perhaps even grow some of them in Cambridge in England. And this became the Watkins collection, which has 1,000 different bread lines of bread wheat that were saved. And that was in the 1920s, so it's now 100 years old. So the idea of endangered foods and saving endangered foods is not new, and the concern over the disappearance of genetic diversity in our food is not new. Diversity comes into its own also at the midpoint of the 20th century. So there is the American crop breeder, crop scientist, Norman Borlaug, who was on a mission to try and create or produce more food for farmers in Mexico, and took some of the diversity of the wheat that Vavilov would have been familiar with, and also Watkins, and he took lines of wheat from the Americas and combined them with types of wheat from Japan, and came up with something that was so high yielding, so productive, and was sent out around the world that it was quickly adopted by farmers, and huge amounts of diversity were lost in the 1960s, 70s, and it carries on to this day. So a mission to try and feed the world, but it has consequences because Borlaug's Green Revolution wheat needed huge amounts of water through irrigation, lots of inputs of fertilizer and chemicals, and it also led to genetic uniformity. In the early 1970s, this was already a concern for another American botanist, Jack Harlan, who wrote a paper called The Genetics of Disaster, which was arguing that if we did lose more and more diversity of seeds, that we would face catastrophic starvation on a scale we cannot imagine. His ideas weren't that familiar at the time, but the ideas that Harlan was presenting in the early 1970s really came into their own in this more recent time. So in the Arctic, a tunnel has been dug in which there is a vault holding hundreds of thousands of different seeds. This is the backup for all the seed banks that exist around the world, so lots of the genetic diversity. And what's inside that vault at the end of a tunnel in the Arctic Circle is the legacy of thousands of years of farming of my ancestors and all of your ancestors as well. But what does that, and also the Watkins collection is a living collection for crop scientists today being used. At the moment, we're familiar with conversations about rare minerals, and we are seeing global competition for different parts of the world and territory and landscapes because of access to rare minerals. Behind the scenes, perhaps less well told, this is a meeting in Rome at the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization. This is the politics of seeds playing out in a treaty meeting, different governments, different industries, discussing who has access to the seeds in that seed vault in the Arctic, because this diversity now is really being recognized as important to feeding populations. If you have access to the genetics, you can feed your populations because you have the ability to adapt to drought, to flooding, to different types of soils, to the different need for nutrient profiles. Diversity gives you options for the future. And also, as we are seeing climate change as well, we are seeing different types of diseases spread around the world, impacting the global crop of wheat and rice and maize and many of the other foods that the world depends on. And so the collection that I mentioned, the Watkins collection, that is now being used by scientists to take wheat back through its evolutionary history, because the problem is with that uniformity, we are seeing, again, spread of fungal diseases and the problem of higher temperatures, lack of water impacting on yield. We need to, again, increase the diversity of the crop. So I wanted to understand that story of where our food came from and why was it that we'd lost so much diversity. And so those maps that I've shown you, I wanted to go to the centers of origins of all of those different crops. So I went to eastern Turkey and I tracked down the oldest cultivated wheat on the planet, which is a type of emmer wheat, which has been grown by one community. It can be traced back 7,000 harvests. And it's important because Turkey was one of the centers of origin. It had huge amounts of diversity. It's now a nation that imports most of its wheat. Not only has it lost the diversity, but actually it's lost the ability to feed its own population with a crop that originated in that part of the world. And not only has Turkey and most other parts of the world lost the genetic diversity, they've also lost the skills associated with that diversity as well. So this is the last miller who knows how to deal with emmer wheat in that community with this hulled type of wheat. The wheat is really important to that community because they see it as their inheritance. They think it's also a type of medicine for them. And they have a very deep connection with it in a culinary way as well. Because as the crop has been saved, so have the skills to turn that into various kinds of dishes as well. All of that has been disappearing. But there are people who are helping this community to keep farming and make the crop viable. Here is a chef, Maksut Askar in Istanbul, who is putting that wheat on his menu and telling that story to an urban audience who do not know that history, but it's important. And this is where I think chefs really do play an important role as storytellers in their restaurants, through their menus, through their profiles, and sending signals often through these supply chains. Chefs, restaurants, food businesses play a crucial role in maintaining that edible form of biodiversity. I also went in search of maize to Oaxaca, up into the highlands, a place where in the late 1970s, botanists were visiting and came across some unusual looking maize in high altitude villages. What they came across, very, very tall maize plants, which not only had roots underground, but had very strange, weird-looking aerial roots coming out of the stem as well. Not only that, but these aerial roots were dripping mucus, a liquid. And they could not figure out what the role of these aerial roots was. It's only in the last 10 years that scientists at UC Davis analyzed what was happening inside this maize plant. And the plant is releasing sugars through that root system. And in the mucus are communities of microbes, bacteria, that are fixing nitrogen in the air and fertilizing the maize plant. This is very different to what's happening in the Corn Belt in the US. A very, very unusual plant. But this is one of the last villages where this type of maize exists. And we are losing diversity that we don't even fully understand how it works, what it is, and what its value is, not only to the community that have looked after this crop for thousands of years, but also to the world. The world is losing this diversity. And the final example I want to use is pulses. Very interesting hearing about the work underway to find alternative sources of proteins. And I watched that with great interest. But I also think that there are many cultures around the world in which the greatest culinary achievement is the use of legumes as well. So I think, thinking back to the Fertile Crescent, 10,000 years ago, farmers created what people now refer back to as the Neolithic package, which includes wheat, barley, chickpeas, lentils, and bitter vetches, so kind of green leafy plants. All of these foods disperse as people migrate and farmers move and they arrive into different parts of the world. And the lentil, one of the most humble ingredients of all, was no different. And it moved along river systems mostly, and one of them, or at least some of the lentils arrive in southern Germany in a rocky mountainous area where it's quite difficult to grow crops. And so they had this lentil called the Alb lentil. And this became part of their culture for centuries. And they created dishes based around this lentil, which looks and tastes different to any lentil that you've come across. And this lentil was lost. 1960s, 1970s, Canada becomes the #1 grower of lentils in the world and sends lentils, those orange lentils, around the world. They disappear from this part of Europe. There's a farmer who's featured here who thinks that this is a tragedy. He's lost something that tastes delicious, part of a farming system, and he goes in search of this lost lentil and approaches seed banks in Germany and elsewhere. He decides to travel to Russia with a group of other farmers from that part of southern Germany, and eventually in the archives finds out that somebody did collect a lentil and take it to Vavilov seed bank. And here he is in St. Petersburg being reunited with this seed, with this lost food. And you can see this emotional connection with this food. But it also then becomes this commercial product, which he is growing with 100 other farmers in Germany. And his story inspires other farmers in Europe and the US, and many other countries as well, to look back at what we were eating before we became so dependent and expectant of huge amounts of meat. Because one of the consequences of the Green Revolution was we produced so much grain that it was more than the human needs. So you could feed it to livestock, to animals, and you produce huge amounts of animals producing meat. But for most of our history as a farming species, 10, 12,000 years ago, lentils, peas, and beans were one of the main sources of proteins. And I think many people would argue that that is a solution in terms of soil health and our health and the reduction in meat consumption as well. So that's some of the story of how diversity came into existence with these crops and the way they move around the world, and they adapt, and they're selected, and they suit cultural preferences. And some of the reasons why they're lost. In terms of why we should care, we've covered some of that in the talks earlier about the boundaries we're breaking through now in terms of agriculture's use of fresh water, for example, loss of biodiversity with land use. We know that in terms of public health, the food system is not serving us well when it comes to our health. And there is also a concern about what it's doing to the planet of the loss of biodiversity as a whole. There is now a framework to try and save more of the world's biodiversity, which is 30 by 30, to try and make sure that we save 30% of biodiversity by 2030. And you might think that this just refers to birds and other wild animals in the Amazon. This commitment is actually to save the diversity that farmers have created over time. So the agro-biodiversity is now recognized as crucial to our future. I mentioned about losing diversity that we don't really understand. We now know that there are types of plants that interact with the soil and with soil microbes in different ways. So there are older, more traditional landrace types of wheat, for example, that interact with microbes, bacteria, in ways that they create more growth, more nutrient density. And we know from the emerging science of the gut microbiome that there are so many things we do not yet understand about the gut microbiome and its impact on our physical and mental health. But one thing that we do know from many, many studies is that the greater diversity of our gut microbiome, the more beneficial that is to our physical and mental health. And the more diversity in our diets, the more that creates diversity in our gut microbiomes. The first story in Eating to Extinction is me traveling to Tanzania to spend time with some of Africa's last remaining hunter-gatherers. There are just a couple of hundred hunter-gatherers, the Hadza tribe. They have a potential menu of 800 different plant and animal species, huge amounts of diversity in their diets. They are not a proxy for our, our ancestors going back thousands of years. They are thoroughly modern humans who are opting to live as hunter-gatherers, but they have maintained that diversity that we evolved with. We've lost that. When archaeologists dug up a body in northern Europe that was around 3,000 years ago, 3,000 years old, and perfectly intact because it was preserved in a bog, they could look inside the stomach and see the seeds of 40 different plants. It's only in recent generations we have lost that diversity in our diets, and we still do not know what the consequences are of that loss of diversity. We're still learning. It's almost like we are all guinea pigs. What's really exciting, so just before coming here, I visited a team that is linked to the Rockefeller Foundation and the American Heart Association, working on a project called the Periodic Table of Food Initiative. And this is trying to unravel the so-called dark matter of food. We know from food labels that there is, we know the big food groups, the big nutrients in our food. What they are doing is unpicking the chemical compounds in a carrot or an apple, tens of thousands of different molecules, some of which we don't even have a name for. What we're really starting to appreciate is the complexity in our food, and also different growing systems reflect that different profile of those foods. And what they are really starting to understand is that there is a huge amount of complexity in all of that, that diversity that will have an impact not only on the flavor of the food, so we can start to explain why one apple tastes different to another, but also in the way our bodies interact with those chemical compounds as well, that will be beneficial to us. So I'm convinced that as this project develops and as we learn more about the importance of diversity in our diets, the most selfish of reasons will kick in, and we will see that diversity is really important to our health. I want to finish with 4 minutes of a short film. So I've recently turned one of the chapters of Eating to Extinction into a 20-minute film. I won't play the whole film, but I'll just play you the first 4 minutes. Just to give you a sense of why I think these stories are so important, but also there are reasons for optimism, because there are still communities around the world today who are living with and are maintaining that diversity that gave us the food that we have today.
Every food has a beginning, and for citrus, the story starts in this dense forest landscape. These are the Garo Hills, near the slopes of the Himalayas, where India's northeastern border bumps into those of China and Myanmar. This is one of the world's great biodiversity hotspots, home to hundreds of different kinds of birds and animals, and thousands of plant species. And that rich biodiversity also includes food. A wild and endangered ancestor of all the oranges found around the world today grows here. To scientists, it's known as Citrus indica. But to the Garo people, one of more than 200 different tribes in northeastern India, it's known as the fruit of ghosts. It's a food at the very center of their way of life. But the story of Citrus indica matters to us all. Think of these forests as a living gene pool, one that contains everything the fruit has been in the past and everything it can be in the future. And in a world in which we've lost so much diversity from our food, that matters. We're so used to watching nature documentaries about endangered big cats or rare birds or unusual types of sea life. But I've walked for 2 hours in search of this fruit, Citrus indica, Memang narang, the fruit of ghosts. And this fruit, this tiny, small, cherry-sized citrus, this is an ancestor of so much of what we eat when it comes to oranges that grow in monocultures in Florida, in California, in different parts of Europe. But here deep in the Garo Hills, this is where it begins. This is the center of diversity for citrus, and Citrus indica is one of the most important and endangered ancestors of that citrus.
Thank you. Thanks. And you can see the whole film, complete film, 20 minutes, on my website, dansaladino.com. So it takes you into the journey of why, how the citrus spread around the world, created huge amounts of diversity, then the monocultures, and also what we're losing when it comes to that diversity of not only flavor and culture and identity, but also of some of the properties that we will need for the future. So it turns out that citrus greening disease, which is causing a huge impact for citrus growers in California and elsewhere, there are the genetic traits that could create more resistance to that disease in the ancestors, in the wild ancestors of citrus. And I do want to place a lot of emphasis on food security and the food system and all of, but I think it's important to think about the cultural significance. We've had conversations today about the cultural significance of what we mean by tradition and authenticity. But if you think that humans, for most of our existence, if you think 2 million years of bipedal humans, 70,000 years of humans as we are today, no different to us, migrating around the world, exploring different environments, and interacting with biodiversity to create the food of that place as a survival strategy, to be in tune with the biodiversity and the nature of where they find themselves. That is what this is a legacy of, is that connection with nature, with a particular part of the place. And so in the human story, we've arrived at a point where we risk ending up listening to the same music, watching the same films, wearing the same clothes, farming in the same way, eating the same food. And I'm convinced that is not what we were meant to be doing as human beings, which is why I think it's important to tell stories of diversity. Thank you.
I told you that one was going to be good. The film is fascinating. I can't wait to watch the rest. Is there plans to maybe do the other chapters and do the whole series, perhaps?
It's very new. This is almost the first proper screening of the film. So I'm hoping, people have said, when the book came out, oh, this is so visual, and it should be turned into a film. And I think many authors have had the same experience where, okay, that's what people say, but it's a very difficult thing to make that happen. I'm hoping this is actually proof of concept that these are not only engaging enough stories, but important stories that can be captured. And I think as so much is disappearing, it's really important to capture this before it does disappear, because this is why the citrus is important as a story, because there's huge amounts of deforestation taking place in that part of the world, and there's huge amounts of indigenous knowledge that's being lost as well.
You almost found this dream box of stories when you discovered this arc of taste. Did you know immediately, like, you get that tingle as a journalist, like, I'm onto something here, I've got it?
The honest answer is a bit yes and no, because I spent years collecting the stories and telling the stories, but I don't think I really understood what I was looking at. That each one was a beautiful story of a pea from West Africa that ended up in the Sea Islands, or it told you the history of things, and I thought they were little nuggets that were perfectly suited to storytelling, particularly for radio. I did not join the dots between what was in that collection of stories in the Ark of Taste and that bigger, deeper story. It was only when I started to write the book, and then it takes you into that world of human evolution, of the arrival of genetics, of 20th century globalization, and then what we're losing, and that really important question, why should we care? And I think that's what we are, in more recent years, I think we are starting to understand that we are losing something that is a precious resource that's taken literally thousands of years to create, that we've lost in less than a century, and will be increasingly important because of climate change and what else we learn about what's in our food or what's not in our food. Increasingly important for the future, and we're squandering it. Yeah.
And why should we care? Why is this so important for the future, Dan?
Well, I think we've had conversations today, for example, about resilience and food security in some of the conversations. As Vavilov realized in the 1920s, these are the resources that will give us options for the future. And I've given a few examples. I mentioned about the maize and maize diversity that's been lost. In the US in the 1970s, there was huge catastrophic failure of harvests because the crop had become so uniform, all it took was one disease to end up in the cornfields to then wipe out or impact on the harvest. And I think the most famous example of this, which most people will be familiar with, is the banana. So more than between 1,500, 2,000 different types of banana around the world. We are on globally traded banana Mark II, which is the Cavendish. So pretty much all of the world's it's Mark II. Most of the world's pretty much all of the world's globally traded bananas is one clonally propagated banana, the Cavendish. So you take the suckers from one plant, put it in the soil, another will grow. Genetically uniform. It's Mark II because there was another globally traded banana, which was the Big Mike or the Gros Michel, and it had to stop being grown by the 1950s because a type of disease, Panama disease, TR1, made it impossible to produce. It had got into the soil. The fungal disease kept evolving. The banana, because it was grown in monocultures, was trapped and it had no resistance to the disease. Unfortunately, this is happening with the Cavendish again. So it's the perfect example of creating a monoculture with no inbuilt resistance, and it's incredibly vulnerable because, again, as soon as that fungal disease arrives into the soil, that plantation is finished.
And are they working on a Mark III? Is that what they're going to do? Or?
Yeah, they are. But I've spoken to many different scientists working on these problems. Some using conventional breeding. So they're going back to this is why these centers of origin diversity matter, is because that's where the diversity, and you'll find the resistance because of the constant evolutionary process that unfolds. So they've gone back to the Pacific Islands where the banana originated to then bring some of that diversity or those genetic traits back into the Cavendish. There's another scientist I've spoken to who's using CRISPR and gene editing.
Oh, wow.
Different approaches, but they both have the same conclusion, which is that we need more diversity in the supply chain, in the food system. So that's why diversity matters, and that's why whichever way you approach it, you cannot escape the fact that there are no monocultures in nature. And this is why I think some of the technological solutions we're coming up to feeding the world now are problematic, because this is also not only a program of shrinkage of a genetic base of all of our food, but also greater and greater consolidation of the people and the companies in control of our food as well. And I think with diversity, you also can have food sovereignty around the world of farmers who are in a position to feed their communities. And we've ended up in a situation where around 4 companies control most of the world's seeds, the very basis of the food system.
And you could listen to this and get a little bit depressed, so I want to think about some of the positives. What's being done to kind of reclaim some of these foods? And also, while you're thinking about that, what can we do? Is there anything that we can do as regular consumers to have an impact on this?
Well, this is why I think the Ark of Taste was obviously telling a story of a problem, but the fact that somebody out there was actually identifying these foods, putting them into the catalogue, and I could then go and travel around the world and meet people who are literally dedicating their lives to saving these foods, is reason for optimism. Also, the science, and I mentioned just one example, the Periodic Table of Food Initiative, revealing to us the importance of diversity for our health, but also the crop scientists who are now having to bring diversity back into the system. There is without doubt recognition at every level that diversity matters and we need to be saving more, which is why I showed that picture of that meeting in Rome, because so valuable is this diversity. It is now a highly politicized debate over who has access and who owns this diversity. So these are all very different reasons for saying there are reasons for optimism, because there is a recognition that Vavilov in the 1920s was absolutely right to think that we needed to save this diversity.
And what could I do, me as a regular Joe?
Well, I think one other thing about diversity, there is so much pleasure and joy to be experienced in this diversity as well. I was lucky enough just a few nights ago to have dinner with somebody who spends his time. This is a guy, Franco Fabini from Natura. So he travels around the world in search of the best tasting examples of fresh produce.
Oh, wow.
So we had 5 different types of citrus in celebration of watching the film. And again, so much pleasure in exploring these flavors that I think that's probably one of the biggest arguments. And I think this is why I mentioned chefs before. There are no better storytellers or, in fact, demonstrators of diversity than chefs. They are in a unique situation to create menus and experiences in which they tell stories of diversity. Might be a bit too much for me to say they have a responsibility, but actually I do think they have a responsibility to be part of this and to be making sure that they have at least something on their menu that tells that story of diversity. And I think most of the stories we heard today around restaurants have actually been based on that. So another reason for optimism, I would say. In terms of what we can do, the epilogue of the book is called Think Like a Hadza. And I mentioned about the Hadza having a potential menu of 800 different plant and animals in their diets. We cannot go back to being hunter-gatherers, nor would we want to be hunter-gatherers again. But at least we can think about what is in our environment. And by that, I mean not only what's growing in the environment which we are living in, but who is out there who is producing a food or using a technique that we can support. And we all carry around in our pockets phones in which we can create virtual supply chains, that we can engage with food producers and with farmers directly, and we can offer our support to them to say, keep going, save that diversity, and actually get the pleasure of eating what they're producing as well.
And I think you're right about chefs, and the good thing is they don't shirk that responsibility. Many of them have taken it on. You see them taking roles with the UN and in education and in governmental levels. I think of Dan Barber as well and all the work he's doing with Row 7 Seeds.
So convinced was he that he set up his own seed company. Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Has this changed the way you eat at home?
Yeah, I think I now cannot look at food without seeing that, or just thinking about that story of how long it took for that food to get here. So just the idea of looking at flour, or think about the wheat story and how long that process has been to create that diversity. And I think this is, I really believe that in schools they should teach the story of where our foods come from. This idea that every food has a beginning. And I think it's just the most wonderful story to tell anyway. It's just so important that we know the fact that there is a beginning, and there has been this journey of humans and foods and plants and seeds around the world that has given this incredible diversity, which you can walk into a supermarket and be completely disconnected by.
Yeah. And how do you feel about today's conversations? We've been really focused on innovation, on future, on new techniques. How does this play into all this? Does this disconnect us more from food heritage, or does it connect us more? How do you see it?
Well, if you look deeply at food history, or the history of human beings, so one example, to think that, and I mentioned the tubers and the fact that humans could then live up in high altitude places where very little else could grow. The same was actually true of the relationship between humans and animals. So it was only possible for humans to settle in particular parts of the world because they had animals with them. And I guess the best example is cattle, goats, sheep, for example, that they could feed off a landscape that we couldn't, but we could drink the milk and we could make the cheese. And then think, well, 8,000 years ago, somebody started to work out a process by which you could take that liquid milk in quite a hostile, high-altitude place and turn it into a solid that you could transport and store over winter, which means you could survive, which gives us cheese. Now, that was a new technology, and so there is nothing new about humans coming up with new solutions of taking foods, processing them in different ways. The question I have, and it might be answered by the Periodic Table of Food Initiative in the future, is this incredible complexity that you get from a food that has been this interaction between soil and microbes and sunlight and genetics and the diversity, and then with some foods, interaction between soil, pasture, livestock, humans, incredible, mind-blowing levels of complexity. And I wonder, can we replicate that in a lab? And what does that mean as we learn more about the complexity of nutrition, which is a young science? How can we replicate that complexity, which we're only starting to unravel?